Should education nowadays be based on the concept of blank slate? This is a controversial question, and this is a current question that education should have discussed in order to improve the academic processes. Before continuing this discussion, we need to understand what is that concept of blank slate. The idea of blank slate comes from John Locke's philosophy, the empirism. This idea stipulates that the human being is literally a blank slate. It's like a white paper, and the experiences provide a human being all the attitudes, the behaviors, the way of life and thinking. However, current scientific studies and the biology give us another possible path to understand our behaviors, our way of thinking, for example. So, taking into account that brief contextualization, I consider that the education should not be based on the concept of blank slate. I'm going to develop those main arguments, and after that I'm going to mention some consequences, some limitations, and some challenges that the challenge of this idea could bring. First of all, human beings are not a blank slate. According to the psychologist Steven Pinker, he mentioned that we have neural circuitry, we have cognitive process and mechanisms in our minds. So these biological principles, those neural systems determine our mind, our behaviors, for example, our attitudes, our abilities, even our talents. So in that case, we can infer that the learning process could be determined also by these biological principles. So in that case, the learning process could be different in each person. Obviously, the thinking process, the way of thinking, is also shaped by our genes. Taking into account that, education needs to understand that there are complex systems in our minds, that there are complex structures shaped by our genes. And educators need to understand and study those biological principles in order to make those different actions in order to improve our educational processes. On the one hand, educators need to understand those biological connections, those innate systems that the human beings have, in order to understand those processes of learning and be conscious that there are, for example, multiple intelligence, and there are some intelligence that are more developed in some students, or for example, there are some students that have who have some abilities than others. So this capacity of understand that human beings are different, are unique, we can say, allow to understand that though this learning process has to be carried out in different ways. And on the other hand, the education needs to understand these complex systems to improve and build new educational, for example, planifications, or for example, lesson plannings that permit students develop his or her abilities. Obviously, this situation, this dynamic implies that, for example, the teacher knows the students, and the teacher knows, for example, their abilities or their fallacies, for example, and this situation makes us to think that the education cannot be equal for everyone, and the education has to stop this idea that make a balance or make an equality in the educational processes. Secondly, education nowadays should not use this concept of blank slate, because it would be to return to the traditional education and, for example, its methods. That is that, for example, the education nowadays would be separated to its main objective, that is to develop human capacities, to boost, for example, social skills and intellectual skills, or, for example, to foster skills that each student has. If we analyze deeply this concept of blank slate, we can identify that the traditional education has been based on this idea of the blank slate. The student goes to the school to be filled of knowledge or a lot of information, so the teacher has the responsibility to give him a lot of information that can be useful in the future. Yeah, but it doesn't solve, or it doesn't boost this objective that make in the person integral to the society, for example. So in that case, in words of Freire's pedagogy, this is a banking education. So in that case, students could be easily manipulated by the new ideologies that we have. So in that case, nowadays the education needs to boost students' skills and develop, for example, universal skills that human beings have. For instance, to develop a language and acquire a good way this language, or, for example, to develop a thinking, specifically a critical thinking, in order to analyze and critique our society, our reality. And obviously another a universal skill, for example, is to infer for example, information in a text or in a video, for example, or even control human drives. No, this is a main objective that education has. Obviously, this idea reject the concept of blank slate in the education nowadays. So for that reason, and taking into account those main arguments, I think that there are some consequences that this change of concept in the education could bring. First of all, teachers' training would change in order to add these biological studies to understand how the brain works, how the human being behaves, for example, in the educational process. Another consequences is that the education would establish new curricula at schools, at universities. On the one hand, at the schools, the education would change the curricula in order to understand the student's brain, in order to improve the educational, for example, classes, in order to improve, for example, the skills. That there are some students that have physical skills, so how can we carry out the physical education at school? Or, for example, there are some students that have mathematical skills, so how can we create or think a new educational program in order to develop these skills. However, there are some limitations in this change of idea, the blank slate in education. For example, current dynamics at school is huge limitations in that don't allow these changes. For example, the exaggerated number of students per class doesn't allow the teacher that the teacher has the time to talk with each student to understand their abilities, to know them, to know, for example, their abilities, their difficulties, yeah. And other limitation is, for example, the universalization and massification of academic knowledge at schools. For example, this idea established in laws that there are some standards that utopical standards that students that the students need to achieve. For example, another limitation is that actually the blank slate is a strong and immersed idea in the educational programs and in our minds. Yeah, so the blank slate itself is a strong limitation in order to change this concept in the education. However, finally, there are some challenges in this change of the concept of the blank slate in the current education. First of all, the teachers need to study those biological principles to be more uploaded, to be more conscious that there are some biological systems that there are innate systems in the human beings that determine this, for example, learning process. And obviously this comprehension could improve for example, the educational praxis of teachers at school. Another challenge is to develop an interdisciplinary exercise, for example, between pedagogy, psychology, neuroscience, for example, biology. Could give new points of view of the education and the process at school, at university. So there are some limitations and there are some obstacles that could not allow this change of concept of the blank slate at the education, but we need to reflect and rethink this concept in our education to improve these educational processes in our society.